Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is the Ukraine War Frontline update for the just about hanging on to the 30th of August, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, August, 31 days. So we have another day of August tomorrow, sorry, old habits die hard. So it's almost the 31st. This will be the 31st by the time most of you listen to this. This is a frontline update that is a couple of days in the making. It's probably marginally outdated by point of fact that Andrew Perpetual has done a frontline update since then. He's done a live stream, actually, that I might dip into a little bit later. But he's done a mapping update 2 hours ago, which won't be covered by this. I don't know how much change there will have been. I have just come back from the cinema seeing Alien Romulus, which was a thoroughly good, enjoyable film, bit of physics, disbelief, but generally had a great time. Was smiling a lot all the way through it and on the edge of my seat as well, immersed, loved it. But I was always going to love it anyway. And I'm largely into some wine drinking as well, so I'll try and remain cogent. Okay, now there has been some tremendous pinnage going on today. This mapping update took me an awful long time, and I think it's because it's probably 2 days worth of Syriac mapping updates. So that's the pro-Russian mapper that is responsible for most of the pins on here, and a hell of a lot of pins along the eastern front line. Now, this is telling you that things are going fairly rapidly for the Russians. It is a game of two halves. No, a game of two different pitches here. It seems that it's Kursk on the one hand for the Ukrainians, and then broadly speaking, the Donbass, Pokrovsk, Toretsk, New York, but also Vuhledar. Couple of areas on the south that there could be some resurgent Russian activity as well, but always with Syriac maps, take it with a pinch of salt. Okay, we'll look at Kursk first, and the Ukrainians are still pressing in a number of places, although there are no real changes for Andrew Perpetual apart from some gains for the Russians actually in the Koronova area, pushing the Ukrainians back there. There are some serious gains here for the Ukrainians as far as Syriac maps is concerned, but actually there are some real differences between the mappers in this general area anyway. So if you look at the northern part of the Kursk incursion, Syriac maps does not have the Russians nearly as far forward as Andrew Perpetua, and that means that these changes might well have been already registered with Andrew Perpetua previously, so it's hard to know whether this is anything that's happened in the last 24 hours, even though that's how it registers with Syriac maps, and that's what you get for synthesizing two mappers together on one map. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. So a lot of changes, a few over here in the west. There is talk about the Russians, holding on with, white knuckles beneath the same river here. The bridges have been blown along here, and the Ukrainians looking to push westwards, but there's been no change in the mapping around there, at least when I did my mapping update. Most of the changes coming in the east and the north, a few just below Koronova here around Vishnevka on the way to Yorosovo there in this Krasnoktiabarskoye. Goodness me, that's challenging at this time of night. So yeah, the Ukrainians pushing in a number of places there, but if you looked at Andrew Perpetua's map when I was checking that out, actually no gains for the Ukrainians. So take it all in that kind of context. Okay, so let's look at some of the sources on Kursk, and of course we go to Null Reports' daily thread on Kursk, and less fighting's reported by both sides doesn't mean nothing's happening. Ukraine is also digging trenches, and that's important, digging in, preparing for the long haul, moving possibly to a stage of positional fighting as opposed to large swathes of land that the Ukrainians are taking with this sort of lightning surprise attack. The Russians have gathered their senses. They've brought defensive forces to bear in the region, and the gains are a lot more grinding at the moment. Momentum, as he says, has passed. What else is there? Railway track being taken out. That was yesterday. The talk of a private military company, a Russian private military company called the Bears Brigade, that has moved from, or is moving from, Burkina Faso. So this shows you that the Russians are really quite desperate to defend Kursk, but they're also desperate not to take troops from the Pokrovsk area, because that's where they're having the greatest success. So exactly like I've been saying on previous days, Putin is avoiding announcing a formal mobilization, but is instead forming volunteer units to counter the Ukrainian advance in the Kursk region, according to the Institute for the Study of War. He's not redeploying his army from priority fronts, where he plans to continue offensive operations. These volunteers undergo training and sign 6-month contracts, and apparently they're building sort of militias in the Kursk area as well, giving them limited training. So things are desperate, but not so desperate that they have to pull from Pokrovsk, and therefore this is again military chicken, exactly as I've been saying for the last week or so. Russian sources report that fighting in the Kursk region is now unfolding near Kamishevka and Kirivka. This coincides with new geolocated footage showing Ukrainian infantry groups operating south of Kirivka. So this is now on the eastern side of the sector. So let's have a look and try and place those geolocations or those places on the map. It might take me a wee while to do that. Actually, no, that's just north of here. That's Kirivka and Kamyshovka. So Andrew Perpetua's blue line there showing that those two settlements are well within the grey zone and on the edge of what Ukraine controls. So it maps very much a different situation where they have the Russians controlling all of that area several kilometers further to the south there. So the difference between the two maps in this general area is about almost 6 kilometers. So that's a massive difference there. Now, the no reports claiming here that geolocated footage suggests that the Russians are reporting fighting there. So it's probably a grey zone in that area. Russia is actively constructing defensive positions in the Kursk region, specifically around the village of Komyakin, about 9 kilometers from the Kursk nuclear power plant. Trenches are being built directly around the cemetery. We have also seen, and Andrew Perpetua talks about this in his live stream, evidence of the Ukrainians building trenches in this kind of area here, or it might be, or probably both down here somewhere. One of these, I think it's up in this area. So trenches are being built. There's evidence of Russians using quite a bit of aviation guided glide bombs in the area as well. Now, Russian source Romanov confirms that both Nechayev and Nizhnaya Paravaya in the Kursk region have come under Ukrainian control. That was geolocated yesterday, as according to no reports anyway, but we'll put that on the map as well. So those two villages are quite close to the Kirivka and Kamyshovka that we we're just talking about. This is in the area that Andrew Perpetua has, already Nechayev on the map for Ukrainian controlled, and the grey zone there really for Nizhnaya Paravaya. Both mappers disagree to some extent in that general area. So evidence coming through that Ukrainians are making gains in some of these areas, but they will be grinding. They won't be as fast as they were previously. The Ukrainian forces, on that note, have advanced apparently 2 kilometers in the Kursk region, gaining control of 5 square kilometers, according to Sursky. The offensive operation in the area continues, he says. And yeah, I don't know if there's too much to add. Interesting that no reports here says short thread today, maybe tomorrow more exciting news. I don't know if that's a cryptic or that's just a hopeful claim there. Now, Daniela, that I interviewed or had a chat with, more accurately, had a chat with from Tuchny yesterday on a live stream, says there have been reports of the Ukrainians pushing at Koronovo following a successful targeting of bridges and pontoon bridges along the same river. So just to remind you, Koronovo is this larger town. It's one of the larger towns in the region that they're fighting over at the moment. And this is where Andrew Perpetua has the Ukrainians pushed back a little. And then you've got the same river going along here with bridges taken out at Karij, Zvanoya and Glushkovo, with pontoon bridges taken out at other places along there as well. Supposedly Tetkino's under quite a lot of pressure down there. Anyway, Daniela says 2 newly constructed bridges have become targets for the Ukrainian Air Force. The offensive itself, taking many international observers by surprise, saw successful advances made by the Ukrainian armed forces within the first few hours and days of the operation. Operations in the Kursk area have been intensifying and were likely already taking shape by early June. During the lead up to the offensive, there was an escalation in activity overall, but particularly in terms of drone strikes, which Andrew and his team documented at the time. So it's interesting that the Tuchny guys and Andrew and his team were seeing the shaping operations taking place. 7 strikes were carried out using FPV drones on substations of various sizes, and I remember reporting that at the time, or logistics points of electrical grid maintenance. These attacks occurred between the end of June and a few days before the start of the offensive in Kursk. The secondary elements that appeared to have been prioritized as targets were both communication facilities and trucks. Most notably, an R416GM station used for long-range communication was destroyed during the offensive's preparatory phase. This attack is significant because it took place over 20 kilometers from the border and was carried out using a DART drone, which is a winged first-person view drone. This is notable because of the announcement of 60 DART drones being delivered to the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade and the 93rd Mechanised Brigade on June the 3rd, a delivery that correlates to the date of the aforementioned strike. The border area had been the target of a deliberate operation designed to assess, equip and test Russian capabilities. Based on Andrew's data, it's evident that Russia carried out frequent drone strikes and shelling throughout this area, suggesting that both its soldiers and local command at the border were likely aware of an ongoing Ukrainian presence. This further supports the theory that, as in the past, warnings from lower ranking officers or soldiers were largely ignored prior to Ukraine's offensive, and this is something we've heard a number of times here and indeed elsewhere. Now, these attacks demonstrate how Ukraine countered Russian electronic warfare, EW, both actively and passively. However, this alone does not explain Ukraine's initial success in deterring the constant threat of FPV drones. The answer to this question can be found in several visual sources showing the location of where electronic warfare systems were systematically deployed. An example of one such EW system of Czech origin has become commonly used in this respect. From the outset of Ukraine's Kursk offensive, Russian Telegram channels reported its personnel's first-hand experience about the use and effectiveness of EW jammers in the Kursk area. Jamming was reported to have disrupted the use of both FPV drones and other assets during the first 2 weeks of the attack. One specific type of jammer mentioned frequently is a dagger-based antenna, which is either dropped by drones or deployed by Special Operations Forces, SOF, to create small corridors for attacking troops. These are also accompanied by other transportable EW systems capable of interfering with higher frequencies, rendering other assets unusable in certain areas of the operations. These are only part of a large number of indicators that allow us to conclude that the Kursk offensive, which is still ongoing, has seen a level of preparation of a remarkable nature with a significant presence of EW systems, drones and other platforms. This further demonstrates how important these systems are in an evolving battlefield, especially when deploying in a combined arms operation. Many who know me know that I am actively involved in supporting an EW battalion, which does essentially this type of job. And if you can support the fundraising he's doing for that battalion, you can go to Daniela, which is at Hearttree Fock, there, Treeefock. So that is Daniela's contribution there. Great stuff there. And indeed, it seems that there was a lot of shaping, and the combined arms included a lot of electronic warfare taking place as the Ukrainians were attacking that Kursk area. So still looking fairly positive up there in Kursk, although it is grinding down to become more of a positional state of affairs there. Now, the Russian mapper Surat Maps shows that in the Kharkiv area, the Russians are being pushed back, or at least there's evidence that they don't control some of the area to the northeast of Vovchansk there. This is one of the areas that the Russians have definitely not been attacking as much. In the Institute for the Study of War Daily Report, I think it's either today's one, today being the 29th or the 28th, saying that they've moved from sort of 10 attacks, I think it's on the previous day's one, 10 attacks in the Kharkiv direction to sort of 1 or 2 attacks a day. So there's a definite drop in Russian attacks in this area as they have pulled troops from there to use them to defend Kursk more. So there is a positive effect of Kursk in a number of places. However, I was saying yesterday that, it's really about Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, and everywhere else is fairly quiet, and that's possibly because many of the troops have been moved to the Kursk region to help defend there. And then you look at a day like today, or technically 2 days worth of activity, and you're thinking, goodness me, the Russians are really going at it. Some people are saying today on a few of my threads that you've got to remember that this is the optimal time to attack for the Russians before the weather starts closing in. So we're moving into September soon. The rains will come, the mud will come. They have to now achieve everything they want to achieve before it gets far, far more difficult. So it could be that the Russians are throwing everything they possibly can, everywhere they possibly can. Okay, then when we come down to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatovo to Crimea, we can see a lot more change than we would normally see, although almost all of the changes we're seeing are Surat Maps, so take that with a pinch of salt. Now, the Surat Maps, I could bore you with all of their additions to each of these areas, all of their individual tweets. But situation on the northeastern front, Russian army made new advances southwest of Pischane. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army recaptured series of positions northwest of Tabaivka. So this is the area where they're getting sort of dangerously close to the Oskil River. And the Ukrainians would not want them getting too much closer because this is having said that, this is a good defensive line for the Ukrainians, but of course, you don't want the Russians to make any more gains than they need to. You don't want them taking all of Luhansk so that they can say they've control of all of Luhansk. So this area of that oblast that the Ukrainians can hold on to is kind of, I guess, symbolically important. But yeah, so the Ukrainians punching back here, supposedly according to Surat Maps, taking a good area of land. It could be that Surat Maps had originally claimed that the Russians had control of this when they didn't, so there's always that side of things to consider. And then we have around here, around Pischane, where the Ukrainians have been pushed back further towards the Oskil River. Surat Maps and Andrew Perpetua agreeing that there is movement there, although the difference here is quite, again, substantial between the two mappers, with a good 3+ kilometers of difference between Surat Maps and Andrew Perpetua. So anyway, some changes there, some further changes as we come down south past Stelmakivka, where the Russians are pushing again to the west. This is Jirelna to the west of there, pushing into these gullies and making some gains, as again according to Surat Maps. Then also some gains north of Terny and Torska on that, between that salient towards, again, the Oskil River. And actually, no, that's not the Oskil River, that's the Zherebets River. The Oskil is much further to the west in this part of this neck of the woods. But nevertheless, making some gains between the Makivka salient and the Terni and Torska area as well. Quite substantial gains here, as according to Syriac map. So, yeah, another one to watch out for. I don't think I've finished moving those lines. Actually, those lines should have been slightly further to the west in that area. So I'll have to make those changes tomorrow. I think it goes down like that in that area. Nonetheless, you know, some fairly substantial gains there. Right, no change to the Seversk area. Now we're going to come on to Chasiv Yar. It's interesting listening to Andrew Perpetua, and he was talking about this claim of 40%. So I mentioned yesterday, was it, that there was a Ukrainian spokesman that had said the Russians are in control of 40% of Chasiv Yar, and he said that's just not true. It's not true. They haven't made any gains into Chasiv Yar. And okay, so if you include all of this as Chasiv Yar, these kind of the Canal micro district and all of this kind of farmland around here, then maybe you could make that case. But it does seem that that is actually not true. And also, he's saying that the Russians are apparently taking some really significant losses here. So this is potentially one of the better news areas for the front line for the Ukrainians. Every time the Russians try and cross the canal area, they're just getting hammered. So that's good news there. I was worried about that claim, but it did seem to come from nowhere. And when Syriac Maps is not showing any gains for the Russians in this area, then you're thinking, well, there probably really aren't any. Still significant that there's a difference between Syriac Maps and Andrew Perpetua with regard to how far the Russians are into the actual main part of Chasiv Yar. Andrew Perpetua is still maintaining that, you know, this is at most grey zone. Otherwise, the Russians are mainly behind the canal as it comes sort of north to south there. So that's some sort of relatively good news for the Ukrainians. Bad news for the Ukrainians is what's going on in Touretsk. Now, he says that it's relatively stable compared to what it has been, as in the Russians aren't taking as much ground in the Touretsk area. But he said some interesting things on his live stream. And always check out Andrew's live streams when he does his mapping. Really, really good stuff. He was saying that he thinks this was all a bit, not quite a mistake, but there's an awful lot of opportunism that took place here, and we kind of know that they were using tunnels, and that was more successful than one could have anticipated. There was a rotation that happened, and they opportunistically took advantage of that, and the Ukrainians just weren't ready. This has been fairly stable since 2014, right? So they weren't really expecting attacks here, and then suddenly the Russians just made loads of gains, and then they carried on that momentum. The Ukrainians were just always on the back foot. So he thinks that, you know, it wasn't really part of their intentions, although of course they would love to have this area and it kind of fits in with their overall strategy. But it wasn't. You know, they've just done really well in this area. So he was saying that the Ukrainians are losing a lot of troops here. So where the Russians are losing a lot of troops in Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians are losing a lot of troops in Touretsk, although it is somewhat stable compared to what it previously was. But according to Syriac Maps, the Russians making some fairly well, not massive gains, but they are significant, especially when you're talking about moving through you know, several neighborhoods in Touretsk, and it's already looking visually similar to Bakhmut in terms of some of these buildings being properly hammered already. And then further to the south, to the west of New York, the Russians are making some gains there, again according to Syriac Maps. So that is a concern. But a major concern is what's going on in the Pokrovsk area. So as I mentioned, I think this morning, since the Kursk incursion started, Russia has doubled the terrain in this area that they have taken control of. So yes, Kursk has worked to draw troops away from a number of areas on the front line, and it has had its really significant impact and success. But the Russians are also throwing, it seems like, everything and the kitchen sink, as I keep saying, at Pokrovsk. They are doubling down on that, and they are making significant gains. So you can see in the north, they're making these gains. They've stopped, interestingly, in this the area that was originally closest to the T0504 highway connecting Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka, going from Novo Oleksandrivka through Vozdizhenka, but that's kind of stopped, and now they're going northeast, getting very northwest, sorry, getting very close to Minorad and Pokrovsk itself. Andrew Perpetua having some gains for them around this area. Where is it? Just north of this large Novohodrivka, which it seems to Novohodrivka. Words. That seems to have fallen relatively quickly, and it's a pretty substantial settlement, that as well. So that is possibly indication that the Ukrainians really are just retreating and ceding territory, not really putting up a huge fight in a number of places, maybe because they want to get to their more substantial defensive lines. But the Russians have already crossed some of those lines already. But you can see that, I mean, these are all imaginary lines that connect these pins. That's where the Russian lines previously were. And they are making gains, literally, according to Surrey maps, almost on every part of this front. And that is happening fairly consistently. I mean, this is a huge area of land to have taken in just a few days. And they are fighting in Solodovo now, which is another really sizable settlement. So this is a really marked difference from the activity a year ago. I mean, this whole area is a bit of a disaster for the Ukrainians in terms of Avdiivka suddenly falling. Again, tunnels being used there. It's the guided glide bombs. It was the use of artillery, the lack of ammunition, the lack of mobilized troops, and it's all kind of collapsed, and it seems to be gathering pace, and the Russians are taking more ground than, this is going back to almost sort of 2 years ago, the kind of speed that they're taking it in some of these areas. Now, the worry, Andrew Perpetua says he's not too worried about Pokrovsk. He says what is a problem is that some of these areas are really well defended here, right? And the Russians at the moment are taking land to be able to come in behind the defenses. And it's this connection of, really, you can even talk about Velika Novosilka here. Velika Novosilka, you've got obviously Vuhledar over here. You've got Kurakova there. This is all very vulnerable at the moment if the Russians can get in behind and then take all this land from behind. So there's a lot of thinking and possibly a lot of defensive action that the Ukrainians need to do to sort out these huge gains, relatively huge gains that the Russians have been taking recently. As you can see by the number of pins, I mean, this took me bloody ages to put together. It just seemed to be advancing in all sorts of places. Now, Krasnohorivka, Novelska, this is all fairly stabilized, Pervomaisky sort of area, interestingly so. Mariinka hasn't really moved an awful lot. There's a few gains, basically a third of a field up there. But generally, that's fairly stable, as the Russians have failed to make too many inroads around here. Now, Andrew Perpetua does have them getting closer to this road that connects Mariinka, Konstantinivka, down to Vuhledar, north of Konstantinivka, which Andrew Perpetua doesn't have the Russians in full control of, but Surat Maps does. So anyway, Novomykhailivka, Paraskevivka moving westwards, the Russians taking control of quite a bit of land there. Now, on his live stream, he was talking about the Russians losing an awful lot of equipment around here, and I showed you some footage from around this area. I think it's a Kurakova direction. So, I mean, goodness knows, it could be somewhere up here, but it could be down here. The Russians losing 14 out of 17 vehicles in a single attack, which is massive. So this is what he has to say of that whole area, that sort of southeastern Donbass region, Donetsk region.
Simultaneously, Russia is trying to attack Vodiana. They're moving up near Vuhledar. They may have captured some of this. I haven't actually seen proof of it. But also, Russia is doing pretty large mechanized attacks west from Mariinka, trying to capture Herivka. They took a whole they took a licking today. They took a licking. They lost. Well, last I heard, they lost like 30 something armored vehicles today, and I think they lost like 30 something yesterday too. So these armored assaults are not going well for them. I believe there may have been an armored assault up here too. I, from what I understand, today they've done, I believe, 5 armored assaults of at least 10 vehicles in this general area today. And I think 2 or 3 of them were here. And I think maybe one of them was up here. But yeah, that's kind of the situation right now. There are a few other points. There was an is
So we'll leave him there on that note. That is to say that they've, as you said, taken a licking, at least in a number of those places, but they are making those advances. It comes at quite a cost. That's the way the Russians do things, but it is slightly worrying. Well, it's very worrying down here, in my opinion. You know, Surat Maps has them gaining north of Mikilska, gaining around the Vuhledar area, around the Pavlivka area to the south, where the Ukrainians had retaken this land in a sort of counterattack some months back. So the Russians did have this, and the Ukrainians took it back. Now the Russians have taken it all back, and some, by the looks of it. And so, you know, Vuhledar is looking very precarious at the moment as the Russians are moving in that direction. But you know, the question, the desire is for the Ukrainians that if the Russians do take these villages and tree lines and fields and roads, that they do so at a tremendous cost, and you would hope that those vehicle losses, 30 yesterday, 30 today, were you hope that they're going to really hurt Russia going forward. Some slight gains for Russia in the Uruzhany area here as well, just pushing north of that settlement, closing up a few gaps there in the river area, the Mokry River there that meanders all over the place in that region. And then actually some Robotina gains for the Russians as they start filling in this area. That this grey line, remember, is the line that the Ukrainians were in on the 30th of May last year. They still have a net gain here, the Ukrainians, over the course of a year and a bit, and the Russians are still trying to push the Ukrainians back to where they were prior to the Ukrainian counteroffensive then. But generally, it is looking very, very dodgy for the Ukrainians in this whole region. Going from the very south of Donbass up to really not the Seversk region, up to the sort of the area south of Chaziv Yar, the Druzhba area and Toretsk there. So really alarm bells ringing about that neck of the woods. Interesting that they're still pushing, according to Surat Maps, in a number of these other areas on that northeastern front line. And Kursk is grinding on for the Ukrainians, but they are slowing down, I would have thought, starting to dig in. And if they dig in, you may see them make some troops available to be drafted elsewhere if it takes fewer troops to defend than it does to attack. So we'll have to see how that develops. Now, talking about the Pokrovsk direction, Tatarigami here says public discussions increasingly suggest that offensive operations in the Pokrovsk area will stop or slow down due to the worsening weather conditions in September. However, I'm not so sure. Last year's offensive on Avdiivka started on October the 10th and continued through February, and that's a really good point. Although it was an absolute disaster initially for the Russians. Remember, it was October the 10th that they there were claims that actually started earlier than that, so really the beginning of October when they started doing shaping operations. But that's when they were attacking around these kind of areas here, coming down by if you remember, the Terikon, and they were piling in these huge mechanized assaults in October, and they lost absolutely phenomenal amounts of equipment here. But of course, they were attacking in October. So, yep, I was saying earlier that they want to be trying to make all their gains right now because this is the most advantageous time to attack. But it appears that they'll be fine with attacking, possibly. It depends what the weather does, of course. but they'll be happy to continue attacking through into autumn by the looks of it. Now, Tatarigami then goes on to say, I wanted to share a few thoughts, offering a snapshot of the current situation in general and discuss a few key points. The situation in Pokrovsk is indeed severe, but far from hopeless. Ukrainian command has the resources needed for stabilization, though this will require difficult and potentially unpopular decisions. Recent resource shortages stem from both internal and external factors. Internally, issues include delayed mobilization, an ineffective recruitment process, an awful commanding culture, and the government's struggle to balance public opinion with necessary measures. Externally, delays in Western aid, persistent restrictions on weapon use, insufficient military production ramp-up, and slow aid delivery contribute to the problem. So that's a whole plethora of issues that they're facing. Now, the problems in Pokrovsk are not new. Delayed aid from the US, hindered by an isolationist faction in the US Congress, made the fall of Avdiivka easier for Russian forces. This was exacerbated by inadequate defences behind Avdiivka, which Ukrainian leadership chose to overlook, shifting responsibility to already overstretched and undermanned brigades. The situation in Pokrovsk worsened with the Kursk offensive operation, which diverted experienced and motivated brigades, stripping stabilization reserves and allowing Russian forces to advance rapidly. This also echoes back to Bakhmut, where the decision to reinforce a semi-encircled city with experienced troops instead of opting for a timely withdrawal resulted in the loss of many skilled soldiers and officers, weakening the backbone of several effective units. Now, I have to pick an issue with this because he's actually contradicting himself. He's saying Kursk is made worse because they didn't defend... Pokrovsk was made worse by the Kursk offensive because they didn't defend Pokrovsk by sending in experienced reserves. Instead, they sent them up to Kursk. And he said, then he goes on to say Bakhmut was made worse because they did send experienced reserve brigades into Bakhmut to try and defend it rather than pulling out. So you can't have it both ways. You either pull out of Pokrovsk and you pull out of Bakhmut, or you keep holding on to both. You know, there's some double standards going on there. So don't necessarily agree with that approach. I think it's a bit problematic. Anyway, Western sanctions on Russia were never fully enforced, enabling Russia to maintain and even expand its pre-war military production. This leniency suggests that some Western countries left a backdoor open for post-war return, allowing Russia to significantly increase military recruitment payouts without the anticipated economic collapse. Russia is more formidable than many pro-Ukrainian analysts suggest, but weaker than pro-Russian camp portrays. Russia does not have the unlimited resources, whether in terms of personnel, budget, or societal support. While it can be defeated, this will not happen. It will not happen if Ukraine and its Western partners continue to make the same mistakes. Mistakes can be mitigated by an abundance of resources. Russia's ability to sustain the war despite its failures is largely due to its resources advantage. Unfortunately, Ukraine lacks similar resources, and the West is less inclined to bear the cost of these mistakes by Ukraine, even if this will become more costly for the West in the future. Despite the propaganda, Ukraine faces one of the most capable militaries in the world. Historical comparisons to the Russian army of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries reveal striking similarities, yet these armies won numerous large-scale wars. The achievements of Ukrainian soldiers on the ground should not be belittled. Russia has failed to achieve its strategic objective thus far, overthrowing the government in Kiev and turning Ukraine into a pro-Russian state. The war has been far less favourable for Russia than anticipated, and despite all its efforts, anything short of a complete occupation will not bring Ukraine back into its sphere of influence. Sooner or later, discussions about negotiations and a frozen conflict will resurface in the media again, suggesting that a post-war Ukraine with minimal foreign military aid and no security guarantees is preferable to the current situation. In reality, this will give Russia a significant advantage, allowing it to prepare for a potentially more successful invasion. If the West genuinely wants this war to end soon, now is the best time to provide Ukraine with the support it needs to gain a strong negotiating position. Forcing Ukraine into negotiations without such an advantage won't succeed, just as Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 ultimately failed. So the agreements to force Ukraine into kind of peace with Russia post-2014. After all, Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to defy the odds and achieve victories, whether in the defense of Kiev, Chernihiv or Sumy, the counteroffensive in Kharkiv or the liberation of Kherson. Successful strikes on Russian targets deep within its territory, significant damage to the Black Sea Fleet, and inflicting hundreds of thousands of casualties is not something that people thought in January 2022. So, yep, some positives, some negatives. Ukraine just needs to be able to fight with all the equipment it should be receiving and with restrictions lifted so it can strike deep into Russia. But unfortunately, that seems to be not the case at the moment, frustratingly so. Anyway, that's enough of me waffling on. Hopefully that was of some use. Sorry it's taken a few days for me to get this update to you. Take care, guys, and speak to you soon.